tried not to stare at the horn. I really did. Instead, I tried to lock my gaze to Eunice's hazel eyes, which were pretty unusual themselves, as the irises were rimmed in aqua blue, but nope. My eyes of their own volition slid up to the protuberance in the center of her head. Eunice chatted non-stop in a breathless, frantic chirp, and then she stopped abruptly and made a steeple with her dainty hands, showing off a beautiful taupe manicure. "We really think you bring a lot to the table, Janice, and the job is yours if you want it," she smiled brightly. I dragged my attention back to her face. I really wanted the job, needed it post-divorce, 14 years a housewife. But I'm my own worst enemy. I'm really not up to date on all the latest PR strategies. I don't Twitter or Snapchat. I'm really old school. I trailed off in a mire of misery and self-defeatism. To my surprise, Eunice reached across the desk and indicated I should give her my hand. I did so, feeling awkward. What was that thing in the middle of her noggin anyway? Was it some kind of piercing? "Janice, you've got a wealth of practical experience, and I know you haven't been on the job for a few years, but I see the talent in you. I need someone who can be discreet and committed to the good of our clients." She spoke so earnestly it brought tears to my eyes. I blinked them back and squeezed her hand in response. It had been so long since someone had believed in me. "I'm happy to accept the position," I said after clearing my throat. Eunice smiled, and her tiny mouth formed a little Cupid's bow. "Welcome to Spin Public Relations Solutions. You start immediately," she said, and slid a thick file across the desk towards me. She gave a tinkly laugh at my stunned expression. "We like to hit the ground running here at Spin. We have a situation with our biggest client, Bacchus Inc. I'd like you to handle it. Please sign this non-disclosure agreement. Yes, and thank you." She swept the signed document from under my pen and squirreled it away in a desk drawer. I tried to rise to the blistering pace. "What's the situation?" I asked. My brain, preoccupied with the horn, determined that Eunice had some sort of unfortunate skull deformation, which resulted in a 2-inch antler protruding from her head. It certainly didn't seem to hold her back. She was the youngest human relations manager I'd ever met. "So, our client has a number of executives who haven't quite grasped the whole Me Too movement." Eunice made finger quotes in a way that made me think she hadn't quite grasped it either. I opened the file in front of me. There were several bios or profile pages of an assortment of middle-aged white men, and surprisingly several women of various ethnicities. They read like a weird mix of business profile and mugsheet, outlining each client's executive position and responsibilities, and then the allegations made against them. There was also a list of the bad press, and pending court cases against each one. Woo boy, this was not going to be easy, especially ethically. Eunice stood up suddenly, tall and slim in an immaculate white linen pantsuit. I was startled and rose too. "Your first client is here. Please use my office. I'm looking forward to your recommendations." Eunice stepped out from behind her desk and indicated I should take her seat. I stared at the proffered leather chair and then back at her. "Who is my client?" I asked. I was gripping the folder in front of me like a shield. Eunice strode over to the door and opened it to reveal a large, rotund, silver-haired man standing outside. He grinned at Eunice and leered at her, actually leered at her. She invited him in with a flourish and he ducked his head to enter the office. It seemed to my feverish imagination that he seemed to grow and fill the office with a peculiar magnetism. He was also a lot more handsome up close. Eunice introduced us. "Janice Waterman will be handling your portfolio now. Janice, this is Ian Bacchus, founder and president of Bacchus Inc." She smiled extra brightly and I stuck out my hand to Mr. Bacchus. He engulfed it in a mighty grip, and his eyes roved over my curves freely. Eunice turned to leave, and to my utter shock, Bacchus turned and delivered a solid slap to her backside. She gave a surprised yelp and skittered out the office, closing the door firmly behind her. I retreated to her chair to gather my scattered thoughts. Bacchus sat with some difficulty opposite me. He was well over 6 feet tall, and must have been a good 300 pounds, which he wore like a wrestler. I glanced down at the folder on my desk. I frowned slightly and looked him straight in the eye. He seemed amused, and behind his thick beard I could see him smirking. His nose and cheeks were red, but he did not seem to be sweating. "Mr. Bacchus, you have several allegations of sexual harassment made by female employees." I checked the numbers twice to be sure. 1,045 complaints? I stared at him aghast. What kind of a maniac was I dealing with? He winked and smiled broadly at me. "I don't mind making it 1,046. I like a woman with meat on her bones," he said as he widened his eyes at me and stroked his beard. "Do you understand that this is completely inappropriate behavior? This is sexist. Your employees should be able to do their job without harassment." I tried to keep calm, but I could see my words were having no effect. "Everybody is just too uptight in this century. I like to surround myself with beautiful young things, and I like to let them know I appreciate them." Bacchus rose from his chair and stalked across to the left corner of the room, where a small drinks trolley was tucked into the corner. I blinked. Eunice had not seemed like a drinker. Maybe it was for clients like Bacchus, who now made himself what looked like scotch on the rocks. His back was turned to me, and when he pivoted, I saw he had made 2 drinks. Unbelievable. Did he think I would drink with him? I spent the next 30 minutes trying to penetrate his thick wall of machismo and patriarchy without success. He literally could not understand what all the fuss was about. I felt sweat running down my back as failure pressed down on me. My job was to come up with a way to revamp his public image, but he needed to show some remorse. He drank like a fish, and it seemed to have no effect on him. He remained solidly jovial even in the face of my growing frustration. I began thinking of other agencies to send my resume to once this exercise in humiliation was over. "You want to come to a party with me?" He leaned over the desk, and there was no doubt of his interest. I declined through clenched teeth. He smiled and made a mock expression of disappointment. "There was a time when nymphs and sprites would have been joyous to dance at my parties. Plump, delicious human women like you." He stared at me over the rim of his tumbler as he downed the contents. I was about to reprimand him, but then I registered what he had said. I stared. He was completely mad. He had to be. Or I guess with his money he'd be described as eccentric. "Mr. Bacchus, I think we should have Eunice come back to, assess our progress," I said carefully. On an impulse, I picked up the slim white phone on the desk and pressed 0. Bacchus laughed, and the sound echoed in the large room. He pointed a finger at me, and the phone left my hand, hovered, and replaced itself on its cradle. My hand, left suspended in the air, tingled. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tore my eyes from my suspended hand to his broad grin. The tingly feeling in my hands spread to suffuse my entire body. "What? How did you do that?" I asked after a long moment. I was being manipulated somehow, and I was now angry and scared. He was obviously enjoying the moment. He stood at full height, an impressive figure with a barrel chest and paunch. He was radiating light or an aura or energy, I don't know which exactly, but he was definitely glowing. "I am Bacchus, the god of wine and ecstasy," he declared, and the room shook. He looked at me suddenly with concern. "You did sign an NDA form, right?" he asked. Oh boy,